You're not from around here, are you? It is autumn 2020. Wildfires stretching the west coast paint the skies burnt orange. In various places, the hue at noon is blood red. 5 of the 10 largest wildfires in California history burned simultaneously. Nobody alive has witnessed such ruin. It has not been so hot since the Eemian interglacial period some 125,000 years ago, when temperatures averaged under a degree warmer, testing our ancestors' abilities to adapt while seas rose 130 meters over 15 millennia. More recently, in the Bowling-Alarod interstadial, nearly 15,000 years ago toward the end of the last glacial period, sea level rose 4 or 5 meters per century for 5 centuries. As the Laurentide ice sheet covering much of North America retreated, the Great Lakes and the massive Lake Agassiz settled until the latter emptied its fresh water into the Atlantic and disrupted the overturning of cold and warm water. The 1,000-year cold snap in result, the Younger Dryas, ended abruptly almost 12,000 years ago when temperatures rose several degrees in only a few decades. All of this came before the Holocene. Between the origins of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent and the invention of hydraulic fracturing, indeed in the entire history of civilization after we left the cave, Earth has never felt so hot, never changed so fast, but paleoclimate data is not on the mind of the vigilante barking, "You're not from around here, are you?" He is armed. He points his question at an African-American mother fleeing wildfires. She registers the racial overtones of his inquisition. She is stopped at an improvised checkpoint in Corbett, Oregon. Fires threaten the communities around Portland, a white area of the Pacific Northwest. Evacuees take to the roads. It is the year of the pandemic, just after a summer of mass protests for racial justice in the wake of murders by police. An election approaches. The incumbent praises violence. Police assault countless citizens. Over 100 reactionaries ram protesters with vehicles. Conservative legislatures rush through bills to authorize the manslaughter tactic. Hundreds of thousands are dying of a virus. America is about to erupt, wallowing in a desire for what? Not a desire to know. You're not from around here, are you? His eyes dart from her to the other occupants, scan the vehicle, gauge threats. In the back, her young children stare back at the vigilante and the weapon with which he might dispatch them. No, these are not his targets. He is searching for arsonists, saboteurs, the right's hallucinated fixation, Antifa. In nearby Estacada, a journalist is accosted and flees. As he speeds away, a truck intercepts from the front and blocks the highway. Out of the vehicle emerges a gunman aiming his rifle through a journalist's windshield. A few miles south, in Malala, 3 journalists are stopped at another improvised checkpoint, guns raised. The vigilante snaps, "Get the fuck out of here," as he takes photos of their faces and license plates. "It seems like the militants are burning up and out the rural folks closest to the cities," says one member of a Facebook group organizing the counterattack, "because the only way they can fight is dirty versus the more conservative rural folks who would hand them their asses in an altercation." Another suggests they fight. Quote, "Most of us can mobilize and bring our arsenal with us." The radio reports Antifa shooting at firefighters. Police are alerted to the illegal checkpoints but do not intervene. After a school board member organizes citizens patrols, a sheriff's sergeant asks for, quote, "photos of cars and even license plates." He advises vigilantes keep an eye out for, quote, "anything that feels out of place to you. Just listen to your gut because 9 times out of 10 your gut is right." A Clackamas County Sheriff's deputy is forced out of his job after a video goes viral in which he erupts at the imaginary culprits. "What I'm worried about is that there's people stashing stuff, and it means that they're going to go in preparation, and I don't want to sound like a doomsdayer, but it's getting serious, and we need the public's help on this." Another interjects to say that the people around Portland will simply stay home and die in the inferno rather than risk evacuating only to encounter anarchists. The deputy blurts, "Antifa motherfuckers, okay, are out causing hell, and there's a lot of lives at stake, and there's a lot of people's property at stake because these guys got some vendetta." The next day, this same sheriff's deputy advises a citizens group that they must be cautious when using deadly force. When they kill outsiders, he tells them, the courts will demand an explanation. He laughs with them, charms the bloodthirsty piglets. Now you throw a fucking knife in their hand after you shoot him, that's on you. More laughter from the crowd as he reassures them. I am on your side, people. I am 100%. I wouldn't let this shit happen in my neighborhood either, but be smart about it. Over a weekend in September 2020, illegal checkpoints and armed squads spring up independently in at least 3 towns near Portland. Fueled on social media rumors and encouraged by police, citizens organically convert latent climate denial, scouting instead for imaginary leftists while pointing weapons at reporters and families. Thankfully, there are no reports of lethal violence this time. A near miss. You're not from around here, are you? I'm Tad DeLay, and the passage I just read is from my new book, Future of Denial, The Ideologies of Climate Change. And by the way, for listeners of this podcast, Verso is offering a 25% discount if you order on their website. Just use the promo code DENIAL at checkout. The age of denial is over, or so we are regularly told. With each new climate report, protest, and catastrophe, we hear, the age of denial is over, often with that precise phrasing. A supercharged hurricane wipes out a town here. 20 million environmental refugees per year displaced elsewhere. A flash flood tanking property values. A law in North Carolina banning the use of climate forecasts in policies if they might hurt real estate. A failed harvest, a compromised Antarctic ice shelf, Delta Airlines claiming to be carbon neutral, Amazon and Facebook getting a green star in environmental ESG funds, Raytheon getting the Environmental Leadership Award from the EPA, mercenaries targeting anti-pipeline activists as if they are insurgents, drone strikes liquidating unwanted people along the aridity line stretching through the Sahel and Middle East, Tesla making itself profitable by selling carbon credits on its zero-emission vehicles to other companies so that they can emit more as they please. All of those reasonably priced carbon offsets, which in fact come from companies in the global north buying up land in the developing world, a tax credit for solar panels, the largest ever lease of federal land for drilling under the Biden administration, Biden himself vowing that he will never ban fracking, Obama taking credit for the fracking boom. That was me, people. It is all happening so fast. This is all denial. A new carbon dioxide record, a new methane record, a new daily warming record, new summer warming record, new annual warming record. The age of denial is over. Yes, that is what we are told. It's enough to drive you mad. Future of Denial is my 4th book. My writing has always felt sparked by a lingering question left insufficiently answered from the prior project. In 2019, I released a book on the American reactionary white evangelical movement, where I documented that 2/3 of white evangelicals, as well as somewhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of all Americans, report on surveys that they do not believe there will be a 22nd century. This latent but literal apocalyptic future denial resonates with a more concrete, disinterested capitalist future denial, such that the two, evangelicalism and Wall Street, share affinities and work together to unmake the world. However, the incomprehensibly Goliath problem of the ecological crises lingered, intruding in more conversations, filling my reading lists, and robbing my sleep. I started keeping a running list of things that felt like denial, not overt science skepticism so much as material expressions of denial, or behaviors consistent with what we might expect when people who don't believe in or care about the climate crisis are suddenly confronted with its effects. From our opening case study, how do imaginary Antifa arsonists become a more intuitive explanatory heuristic than warmer conditions in the Pacific Northwest? So I kept bookmarking those conversations, those conversion symptoms of denial through 2019 and 2020, when within a few months of each other, I watched as some of the most ambitious climate plans ever proposed by Corbyn in the UK and Sanders in the US, they were blocked by people who likely think of themselves as science believers. And then a global pandemic threw physical safety and supply chains in a dysfunctional society into question. Bold protests for racial justice that summer were met with violent suppression from police and the right. And a few months after the lockdowns began, my first child was born. Fair to say, I was a mix of joy and urgent concern when I awoke one morning to a message from an editor named Sebastian Budgen, who, having heard of my work from writers China Mieville and Richard Seymour, asked whether I might have any projects suitable for Verso, a publisher that has greatly shaped my education. The results of a few years of research is out there now. In 12 chapters, Future of Denial explores psychoanalytic theories of denial, carbon markets and offsets, and the whole history of Earth and its mass extinctions told through the story of rising and falling carbon dioxide. There's a chapter on basic climatology for newcomers and a whole history of discovering climate change over a century and a half. One chapter on Marxist materialism and the law of capitalist accumulation, with the problem of fossil fuel reserves, several chapters on energy systems and decoupling and carbon capture, another asking, what does the liberal want? And finally, at the end, the real heart of the book is an exploration of what this means for the migrants, the climate refugees, the vulnerable. There has never been such a monumentally difficult task, never such an existential threat, never such an interdisciplinary problem as the climate crisis. Drawing on climatology, social sciences, and the humanities, this book builds a hybrid theory of denial for the left with a focus on languages, fantasies, and behaviors of corporations and governments. It is all happening so fast. Precisely forecasting the climate tipping points on the horizon is a fool's errand, but the basic physics are almost tragically simple. The global capitalist mode of production injects about 41 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year. You may remember the 12 Years to Save the World bit from 2018, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a special report saying that if we wanted to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we needed to cut emissions in half by 2030 and reach net zero by mid-century. Well, in that time, fossil emissions have not declined and in fact have continued to climb a bit. Renewable energy is growing exponentially, but we are piling them on top of the energy mix rather than using them to phase down fossil fuels. Several dozen states are actually declining on emissions, thankfully, though that is largely driven by the shift from coal to natural gas, which produces half the CO2 per unit of energy compared to coal. But the upshot is that the so-called decoupled states in the developing world are touting their declining emissions by switching from one fossil fuel to another. Expressed in nominal US dollars today, existing fossil fuel reserves are worth approximately $259 trillion. That's only the reserves, the fraction of total fossil fuel resources in the ground that we can extract with current technology and at today's prices, both of which are subject to change. Firing all those reserves would raise temperatures an additional 1.5 degrees Celsius on top of the 1.3 we've accomplished so far. But over the last half-century, the time left on reserves, called a reserve-to-production ratio, has remained stable at roughly, half a century. There is what we might call a discernible tendency of the reserve-to-production ratio to stabilize. By the way, expressed in US dollars today, the sum total of all fossil fuel resources in the ground is $2.5 quadrillion. The most recent IPCC report suggests that current policy implies a warming of 3.2 degrees Celsius by end of century, although there is some good news that more recent data suggest a little bit lower, a little under 3 degrees. To put that in perspective, the last ice age was around 4 or 5 degrees lower in global temperatures. So if we've already raised temperatures 1.3, we've done about a third of an ice age scale change, just in the other direction. And we did that mostly in the last 3 decades. What I'm trying to tell you is, again, it is all happening so incomprehensibly fast. As vast and complex as the field is, as I said, the basic climate science here is almost tragically straightforward. Key components, like the warming effect of carbon dioxide, were already understood by physicists like Eunice Foote and John Tyndall in the 1850s. And before the turn of the century, in the 1890s, the Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius was calculating how burning coal might warm up the cold climate of Northern Europe. We hear sometimes that Exxon knew back in the 1970s, sure, but some of the basics were literally understood before the American Civil War. In the simplest of terms, Earth is in a state of energy imbalance. It receives the same 174,000 terawatts of energy from the sun as always, but it's no longer radiating out all that energy. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases make the atmosphere slightly more opaque at infrared wavelengths, the wavelengths at which heat is radiated off the surface back into space. A change in the energy balance is called a forcing. I won't get into all the math here, my book has a whole chapter on it for newcomers, but Earth now radiates slightly less energy than it receives from the sun, holding in the equivalent of about 1.3 watts per every square meter. Multiplied across all 510 million square kilometers of Earth's surface, that means Earth every day is absorbing excess heat equivalent in energy to about 900,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs. Every day. 90% of that energy goes into the ocean, out of sight, out of mind, where it will continue to spread, melt ice, and raise sea levels for thousands of years, even after we zero out emissions. So current production rates, as I said, predict that we will burn through all oil and natural gas reserves around the time millennials become centenarians, with coal holding out a bit longer. We have around a half century of gas and oil in reserve, and more than a century of coal at current rates. And of course, as I said, that has been true for about half a century, because as we deplete some reserves, we develop access to new reserves. So the timeline will change as we quicken or slow the burn, or if we learn to extract resources that we can't currently reach. Sure, the timeline is hazy, but the conclusion is not. We will probably burn through most of our fossil fuel reserves and may add more. Capitalism will incentivize renewables inasmuch as they are profitable, not because the legal and political superstructure meets its unserious goals to stop the progress of the storm. Incentives just point in the wrong direction. Climate change isn't a market failure, it is a market success. My thesis in the book isn't complex. Climate denial should be a flexible term designating a broad range of activity. I'm not cleverly twisting some new definition here. We find it intuitive to say that teenage recklessness expresses a belief in invincibility, a sort of denial of mortality. Or later on in life, troubling symptoms are ignored or explained away by a patient in denial about what a physician might diagnose. You don't want to know, so you don't schedule the appointment. You try not to think about it, you actively repress. Or expensive purchases or self-sabotage during a midlife crisis are denials of fading time or unsatisfied desire. People go to great lengths to talk around their racist ideas, or they drink away their troubles at work. We commonly speak of denial as behavioral, but for climate change we reflexively confine ourselves to a narrow meaning of denial focused just on conscious belief. Denial, though, is not an incorrect thought to be transcended or an age to be passed. And even as the consequences mount, there's no guarantee that this will drive public acceptance of the science. In fact, we might well see people react to the changes with ever more denial. Dependence on hydrocarbons generates reactions or symptoms like an atavistic return of the repressed. More belief in correct ideas won't fix this. This isn't Protestantism, where you get justified by faith, saved by getting your thoughts right. But we do indeed tend to treat the climate crisis and its denial like Protestants, imagining that the damned are those who do not believe as we do. Climate denial, though, is far more ramified and expresses itself through material relations like pseudo-solutions and violence. The philosopher Louis Althusser drew two conclusions about ideology. First, ideology represents an imaginary relationship to real conditions, aiding in recognition and misrecognition. And denial does the latter, misrecognition. Secondly, though, ideology has a material existence. It isn't just thoughts. Ideology is housed within ideological state apparatuses, assemblages allowing people to act out and reproduce an ideology. Althusser listed a few of these apparatuses: the church or religious institutions, the schools, the family, the legal system, political parties, unions, media, literature, arts, sports, and so on. An imaginary relationship to real conditions, ideology. In my book, I argue that there are not simply two positions here, the bad science deniers and the purified science believers. I like to think of the battle lines along four positions, two owning class positions and two working class positions. And I'm loosely building on an argument from Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective's book, White Skin, Black Fuel. For the owning class positions, there's an ideological state apparatus they call a capitalist climate governance model. Think of the Paris Agreement, the UN COP conferences, the offset markets, the liberal governing structures addressing climate change on market-friendly terms. Against them, an array of traditional denial machines like Exxon and the like, the climate denialist ideological state apparatuses. But these are both bourgeois, owning class positions. Add to this two working class positions. On the one hand, the revolutionaries and activists, and the reactionary deniers on the other. That second working class position tends to be filled with ethno-nationalists, the characters conventionally labeled as climate deniers. But I'm arguing that this isn't all there is to it. The owning class expresses a spectrum of denial as well, and it is even found among those who overtly are very concerned about climate change. Think of Obama leading on the Paris Agreement and then days later returning home to lift the oil export ban, allowing our glut of fracked shale oil to flow into the world such that America is now the top exporter of natural gas. And of course, for that last position, the workers urgently working to stop the progress of this storm. Of what use is a revolutionary without the dialectical conditions for a revolution? As conservatives mainstream QAnon-adjacent slander by casting opponents as groomers or part of a murky pedophilic cabal, obsessive thoughts about children and sex link today's ethno-nationalists to deregulatory agendas. In other words, there are two alliances that we face in opposition. A bourgeois alliance, the capitalist disinformation machine and the capitalist climate governance machine, and a conservative alliance, the capitalist disinformation machine and their reactionary ethno-nationalist foot soldiers. The characteristics of that fourth position, which I want to advocate for, are hazy, but let's just say that the fourth position detests the capitalist death drive and opposes the ethno-nationalist solution. Brecht said it best about his most minimal demand. Whoever doesn't hope for the end of capitalism at this late date is an enemy of humanity, who does not think or who thinks only about himself. The telos of this fourth position is a post-capitalist ecological socialism, but at the moment, climate activists display a wide ideological diversity. By the end of my argument, you will of course need to decide to what extent even the activist is rife with denial. We must learn the vicissitudes of denial because we are running out of time. Human experience is overdetermined or layered with too many desires, incentives, confusions, and goals, and we need new methods for defamiliarizing problems too casually ascribed to legible logics, sciences, or market incentives. In addition to the pleasure principle, which directs life to enjoy, and a reality principle that checks surplus pleasure seeking, but in such a way as to forego pleasure now to maximize pleasure later, Freud proposed an excessive drive operating beyond the pleasure principle, the death drive. Sadistic or masochistic activity can't always be read rationally, because we exhibit excessive libidinal drives and unconsciously encode our social systems and modes of production with the same excessive drives. What we are watching play out are death drives, desirous of too many things at once. In the next episode, we'll explore the contours of denial along psychoanalytic theory, but to begin it here, Sigmund Freud once observed that his patients responded in two ways to negate anxiety when a repressed idea surfaced. Some patients rejected reality itself, preferring instead to live out a delusion. Others, though, rejected some moral attribute in the idea and denied their own fault. A simple schema: reality denial or guilt denial. Luckily, Americans and many in the global north have a major political party for whichever form of denial we prefer. In conclusion, we are All of us, in denial about what awaits in the changes. Not just the conservatives. Liberals and social democrats deny as well. So too does the left. Denial is a contingency of repression, the putting away of an unpleasant idea. The constant moralizing is obnoxious but also dangerous. The symptoms proliferate, ever more foolish and violent. This isn't a game. Don't you see what is on the horizon? Pathways to collapse are fundamentally unpredictable, nor can we divine the social tipping points. Today's incipient fascisms, as Richard Seymour rightly qualified this contested term, serve up a hint, though. What will happen when hundreds of millions move, when economies plummet? How long until North America and Europe police their borders with armed sentry drones, as Israel has for years at the edge of Gaza? If the choice is socialism or barbarism, a fossil fascism will lash out nostalgically for a time before the seas swallowed the coasts while sneering at fleeing families. You're not from around here, are you?